Hello everybody, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're returning to Strategic Command World War II World at War. This video is part 3 of a live stream, which took place a couple of days ago, but in it I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today. I'm just going to be talking to you about Strategic Command and talking to you a little bit about my initial impressions with the game. So the footage you see behind you was taken from a live stream, but we're not going to be hearing the gameplay audio. We're not going to be actually listening to the stream in today's episode, which would be part 3 of this series. Rather, this is going to be a first impressions video. Not a full-blown review, but just sort of my initial impressions of this game. I've got about 5-6 hours into the game in Steam. I wouldn't say that's enough to do a full-blown review. I haven't completed the war yet, and I think to do that fairly, to do a review fairly, I would need to finish the game at least once, if not more than that. But I do like to do this where periodically, as I play through new games, I kind of tell you my initial take. If you just jump into it, what can you expect? What seems like it's going well? What seems like it's not going well? And maybe what are some items that we need to revisit in a deeper dive, a more full-blown review. So this episode is going to be a first impressions video about my thoughts about Strategic Command World War II World at War. First off, what are the basics? Well, Strategic Command is a game made by Fury Software, the developers of Strategic Command War in Europe, World War II War in Europe, which came out back in 2016 and was the first of the sort of revamped Strategic Command series. The classical games in the Strategic Command series date back almost 2 decades, I think it is, and were originally published by Battlefront, the developers of Combat Mission. The reincarnation of Strategic Command, which started in 2016, is being published by Slitherine and Matrix Games. The first game, Strategic Command World War II War in Europe, focused on the European campaigns and did not include Japan or China or anything outside of the European theater of operations, with the exception of like North America, which was directly supporting Europe, and then also the North African regions, but it did not look at the Pacific at all. In this game, the scope expands. It expands to the Pacific theater of war, and it adds over 4,000 hexes. It's a turn-based hex game. It's a turn-based grand strategy hex game, which basically covers the entire globe. Now, before we get into the actual impressions, I also just want to let you guys know that Jean Marciniak, who is also known as the Strategy Wargamer, and myself have a podcast. It's called Single Malt Strategy. It's available on any of the Google Play podcasting apps. It's also available on iTunes. Again, it's called Single Malt Strategy. And I'm hoping that we'll have an episode about this game in the not-too-distant future. We also do periodically have interviews with developers. It's kind of an interesting podcast. I enjoy doing it. Sort of the idea was John and myself would just kind of sit back and kind of shoot the breeze and talk about games and talk about our thoughts about the gaming industry, where wargaming's going. Really, it's a focus on wargaming, strategy gaming, and a little bit of a booze-infested discussion as well, hence the name Single Malt. The idea is all strategy games all the time, just like there are no grain whiskeys in a single malt batch of scotch, there should be no mixing of more casual stuff, although we certainly do that from time to time. And we'll certainly have an episode on the on Strategic Command, so if that's something that you'd like to hear kind of myself as well as another person's thoughts, certainly feel free. As well as hopefully we'll end up lining up an interview with a developer of Strategic Command, but no promises there. Okay, so I've talked long enough. We're 4.5 minutes into this thing, and I haven't actually started sharing my impressions, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Strategic Command World War II World at War. Initially, it's a very approachable game. You can just kind of easily pick it up and just sort of, without a lot of background in wargaming, I think you can just get a reasonably good understanding of how to play this game, what works, what doesn't, and it really isn't too difficult to play for the layperson. In addition to that, the game has gorgeous art, at least in my opinion. I'm not an artist, and I'm not one of those people who's kind of a graphics sort of aficionado by any means, but I really do enjoy the aesthetics of this game. The game does a really good job of having clear, crisp, and understandable visuals, whether you want NATO counters or whether you want to have actual model-type soldiers like I'm using here. Everything is pretty clear, pretty well put together. It looks like a modern game. It doesn't look like a 1995 war game, so that's a positive. Additionally, the game looks aesthetically almost like you're playing an Atlas to me, especially if you turn on the NATO counters. To me, as you kind of move units around the map, you see the front line move, you see things unfold on the map. Again, it feels like I'm picking up a coffee table Atlas of World War II, and that's a lot of fun. In addition to that, I think the setting is a positive here. So the last game in the series just focused on Europe, as I said, and that was a well-done game, but I think they do a good job of expanding the game into the Pacific theater as well. There's new countries like Japan and nationalist China, and it feels like they incorporated them holistically. They had a good series of events, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that they included in the game to make those countries really feel like they weren't just, hashed together and thrown in there, but there was really some thought put together as these countries were added. The thought put together around how would we incorporate Japan and sort of the naval war in the Pacific into this type of a game, which really is coming from a game that was basically focused on the naval actions in the North Atlantic, but really the land campaigns in Europe. In addition to that well thought out nature of including these countries is the way the game manages China, which I think it strikes the right balance. So the game has two Chinas. It has nationalist China and it has communist China. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the history, at the time that this war broke out, China had already been fighting Japan, and a vast portion of China's territory was already occupied by Japan. But China wasn't one unified country at this time. In fact, there were many warlords throughout China. And you actually have a nationalist Chinese government, which for all intents and purposes plays as that's the country you play as when you're playing as China. There is also a communist party in northern China that controls territory that the nationalists don't control. And so there's this civil war going on in China while China's also trying to fight Japan. And if Japan puts too much pressure up in the north, that can actually drive the Chinese, the communist Chinese, into bed with the nationalist Chinese and cause them to form a united front. If the Japanese intentionally avoid provoking the communist Chinese, then you could still have situations where the communists are actually attacking nationalist troops and benefiting Japan by weakening the nationalist forces. I think the game does a really good job of balancing China's sort of overarching complexity of dozens and dozens of warlords with a more straightforward approach of two Chinas, a communist China and a nationalist China, both of which were the main actors at this time in China, and just kind of abstracting out the warlords for the most part. In addition to that, the game does offer the option of a third China, depending on how Japan reacts to one of the events that they trigger, which would then allow you to set up sort of a Chinese communist, or not Chinese communist, it would allow you to set up a Chinese puppet of Japan as well. So you could theoretically have three Chinas in the game. In addition to that, the event system is well done. So events are basically these things that trigger depending on, where in the game you are. Typically, they seem to be date-based. So, for example, at the end of 1939, you'll get a trigger for Germany to figure out, do you want to plan to invade Poland in 1940 or not? The Japanese at a certain date in 1939 will get a trigger to say, do you want to set up a puppet regime in China or not? And the game does a good job of both explaining what that event was, and then you can even go into the notes where you get a little bit more explanation about, like, why is this a good thing? Why would I want to use this? Or maybe why would I say no? So it kind of gives you both the history behind the event, but it also gives you, the history of what actually happened and what are the perks or the penalties of accepting one of the events in game. And I think that's well done, and I think the new countries especially have some pretty strong events. The game also periodically offers advice to you If you're playing as the Japanese, for example, it'll advise you to avoid going to war with the United States for as long as possible. That seems pretty straightforward, but it's just sort of the example of one of the advice triggers that pops up. Whereas the Germans, it'll let you know that, hey, by the end of this next year, an Africa Corps event will trigger and will be formed in North Africa. Make sure you have enough money on hand to fund the construction of that corps. So I think the events and the historical sort of pop-ups are both very well done. I also think, going back to China, that China's well done as well, in that the front is very much a slog. It's basically a World War I trench type environment where it really becomes a manpower sink for the Japanese. And I think that really does capture what China became by the period this game is covering. There were certainly rapid maneuvers, very decisive victories, very hard-fought, almost Stalingrad-like battles earlier in the campaigns. But by 1939, things are kind of turning into a slog, and you're having things like partisans rising up in the rear of Japanese forces and causing them trouble, raids on Japanese industry that's in China causing trouble, or infiltrators moving through the lines and causing trouble for the Japanese. And additionally, just the terrain of China and the defense and the fighting of the nationalist forces made it increasingly difficult for the Japanese to conquer China, and they could not get that sort of coup de grace. They couldn't finish the Chinese off despite putting massive strain on the nationalist government in Chongqing. And the game does a good job of representing that. You definitely have an advantage as Japan, but you can easily see why more and more troops get sucked into the conflict with China. And it's increasingly, as you start getting involved in the war with America, you're seeing all these troops that could be very useful fighting in other theaters, but they're basically stuck bogged down in China, because you really do need to maintain control of the front line. You do need to maintain a large number of troops there, or your soldiers will end up getting overrun. Moving on. What else? I've already talked about the events. I do want to just mention, I also think the events are kind of an interesting way to allow you some ahistorical options. So this game is not Hearts of Iron 4. It's not trying to be. Hearts of Iron is a very different game that really isn't focused on history as much. I would say this game plays out pretty close to history. You get a lot of different events that can allow you to kind of have different flavors of that history, but largely speaking, the Germans are going to invade Poland, they're going to invade France, they're going to conquer most of Europe, Britain's going to fight against them, and eventually the Russians are going to enter the war. Meanwhile, Japan's going to fight against China, they're probably going to expand into Southeast Asia, and then they're going to end up at a war with the United States. And I think the game does a good job of allowing you to get certain events like, hey, do you want to divide Poland? You know, you can agree to divide Poland, and then Russia will get part of it, and they'll be happy. Or you can say, no, we're going to take all of Poland, but it's going to piss Russia off, so you might end up fighting them sooner. Additionally, you can make choices like, do you want to deploy some of your submarines into American waters? You can do that, but that'll piss the Americans off and probably bring them into the war sooner. So there are these different activities which can occur and which can be triggered by the events, which can either accelerate or slow down or maintain the historical sort of path of the war. But it's not like you're not playing as Morocco, you're not playing as just Italy, you're not playing as sort of these minor countries. It's not a real-time game. It's not really a game about completely changing history. It's a game about fighting World War II with some additional flavor about, how could that fight be a little bit different. But it's really not about reinventing the world. And so that's why I would say the Hearts of Iron game comparison is pretty far from the mark. I wouldn't even consider either of these two games as related to each other, other than they both touch on World War II. Additionally, I think the game does a good job of providing the player with a lot of research opportunities. You basically, in the game, when you build a unit, the unit will have a certain sort of quality based on your basic level of technology for that type of unit. But then as you research other things, you can add sort of enhancements or buffs to that unit, which can affect the build cost. So you could research anti-aircraft guns and then assign a slot to anti-aircraft guns in a given unit. That will increase your ability to resist attacks from tactical bombers, but it'll also come with a cost, and that unit will cost more to raise. Additionally, you can research things like greater mobility, which will allow your troops to move further, but again, it'll be more expensive. And each one of these different units has different types of technologies that you can research, or you can just in general research more advanced units for that type, in which case the icon will change based on your research level. You can see your little tank icon evolve at a level 0 tank from a light German tank at the beginning of the war to eventually looking something more like a late war Panther or Panzer, or I think even maybe a Tiger, but I'm not sure on that. So those are all kind of things to think about, but I do think research is well done. It also gives you a chance to have a little bit more flavor within your country. Different countries start at different research levels that kind of mirror their own history, but Japan could theoretically go down an armored focus and really focus on building modern tanks if they really wanted to, and maybe that would affect the war in China differently. But that's another piece I really like. In addition to that, I like the way that the game handles production. So the game is similar to, a game like Panzer Corps, where you have a certain amount of money, but you also have a certain number of slots of troops you can raise. You can only raise so many infantry divisions. You can only raise so many armored divisions, except it's limited to certain categories. So it's literally you have up to 18 infantry divisions, up to 18 mechanized divisions, up to 3 armored divisions, but it's not limited based on overarching sort of weight of numbers. Again, it comes back down to how many armored divisions can you equip. So you can probably only raise 3 of those. But in addition to that, when you purchase a unit, there's a delay between when the unit is purchased and when it actually becomes available. So when you buy the unit, great, you've allocated your resources and your money to it, but it takes a little while for all that equipment to get purchased. And so you have a production schedule that will unfold over the course of the game. And that does mean that, you can't, it's not as easy as I lost a unit here, I need to buy a replacement and go and buy a replacement. You need to plan that out. There's strategy there in how you want to lay out your production. And I think that's an interesting component to the game. In addition to that, I enjoy the way the game handles the economy. It doesn't go into individual resource-based economy, so there are some resources on the map like oil wells, but they really just contribute to your overall income. You get like an MPP score, which is basically your total economic output of your country in a given turn, and that economic output is sort of a abstracted summation of your country's total resource or industry or agricultural output that allows you to field armies and sort of prepare and fight wars. You can bomb those facilities and reduce enemy income, so that's obviously sort of a historical strategic bombing route, although it's not terribly effective, so again, that does mirror the history. But you're not interdicting iron shipments specifically, so it's abstracted, but it's also there at a level that I think is relatively intuitive, but also speaks to sort of the decentralized way a lot of these economies were built out. You're not just going to cripple Germany's economy by bombing 1 or 2 cities. It's really going to be a protracted effort if you're going to do it at all. In addition to that, every country sort of gets this summarized economy, which is, again, all of these little icons on the screen. So you might have some oil icons. You have icons on cities where there are factories. And all these little icons have points. Those points add up to a total, and that total is your income every month or every turn. In addition to that, you also have trade income, which is represented on the map by these trade routes, which are little lines that cross different spots in the ocean. And those trade routes basically represent the fact that commerce is important. If you're Germany, you're importing a lot of your iron from Scandinavia. That iron is turned into steel in Germany and is vital for your economy. So while it's not specifically saying, oh, this trade route is bringing in 50 iron, it is saying this trade route is bringing in 25 industrial points. If the British put naval assets on that convoy route, they can intercept that, and they can actually hurt your economy through commerce warfare. It's a simple and abstracted way to represent the importance of convoys, the importance of shipping in a game, and the importance of naval units to be able to interdict that shipping without getting into too much granularity or nonsense. In addition to that, the British obviously have convoys routed all over the map, which represents, how important their empire was to keeping their economy chugging along. If you're playing as Britain and all of your convoys have German naval vessels on them and you're not getting any income from outside of England itself, or only a portion of your income from outside of England is coming in, then you're going to be in some serious trouble. The Germans, on the other hand, aren't as reliant on convoys, but they definitely do have them through the Baltic Sea and through the Norwegian coast. And those routes also kind of help you understand some of the strategic realities of the war. The Norwegian route is very important to Germany's economy. It's not an insignificant amount of money that it gives you every turn, but it's pretty exposed to the British if they want to go ahead and intercept those ships. So it kind of gives you another sort of explanation for why Germany took some of the strategies that it took during the war, and it does represent, here's one of the reasons Germany might have considered invading Norway, or maybe when the event triggers and you have to figure out if you want to invade Norway, it gives you a clear understanding of why would I actually do that. There's a strategic reason, and it's because of those convoys. Additionally, there are other things like that, like in China, there's a railway between Hanoi and Indochina, French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, and the southwestern corner of China. That railway is important to providing supplies to the Chinese military and allowing them to continue keeping their troops equipped and moving in this game. So as long as that Hanoi route is open, China's going to be stronger and have more income. The game then gives you an option as Japan to invade Indochina. And you think, okay, that makes a lot of sense. If I'm fighting the Chinese, invading Indochina will allow me to cut off the supply route that American supplies are coming into China. But then but that helps you really understand, all right, why in the strategic picture in World War II did the Japanese invade Indochina? They were fighting China. Why would they expand their war and risk pissing the United States off and ultimately leading to the Second World War being fought? Because after Indochina went to the Japanese, the Americans cut off oil shipments to the Japanese. Well, now this makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense that maybe you take a risk in taking Indochina and pissing off the Americans because it's really, not doing so is hurting you in Japan or in China so much that you really, it's a huge benefit if you can take Indochina and cut off that rail line. So again, I really like the way that trade is represented in this game and how some of these events and how some of your decisions around that trade and around your strategies to deny your enemy of supplies plays in directing the way this game comes together. So with that being said, I do enjoy the events. I enjoy the art. I enjoy the sort of the dichotomy of the way the research works and how you want to prioritize. Do I want to focus on advanced fighters, advanced tanks? Do I want to focus on command and control? Do I want to focus on supply, which is also a thing, by the way. The Italians have big problems supplying their armies in Italy because only a certain amount of supply can come to Italy, whereas, basically full supply can move throughout the Italian peninsula. So supply is represented as well. And I really like how that plays out. The economy is abstracted to the point that I think it clearly conveys where are important spots on the map. It gives you action to reduce the economy output of your enemy. And it has trade routes, which I think do a really good job of helping explain the global nature of this war and why, the Battle of the Atlantic was so important. And why, in Japan's case, they made some of the strategic decisions that they did. Some of my areas where I'm a little more mixed about come with some of the design decisions they made. So, for example, I don't really understand diplomacy in the game. I get it, but I don't understand why I would do it. So first, let me tell you, in this game, there's a window that's called diplomacy where the Axis can invest diplomatic points, which cost industrial output. And we could debate whether that's realistic. Would it really cost the equivalent of a tank division to send 2 diplomats to Russia? Probably not. But the game does represent your ability to invest in diplomacy, and that would influence whether countries will swing more to the Allies or to the Axis. And if they get to 100% in either direction, then they join one side or the other in the war. And the more diplomats you send to a country, the greater the percentage that you have a positive influence on that country to swing more to your side. The thing I don't really get is I don't really feel like there's much utility. So I've mentioned that this game is more of a war game fighting out World War II, whereas Hearts of Iron is sort of a create-your-own-adventure game. And I really think that diplomacy speaks to that. It feels like countries are pretty much hard-coded that, after you get to the summer of 1941, the Russians are just going to rapidly slide into the Allies' bed. So if the Germans don't attack them in 1941, probably by early 1942, the Soviets are going to attack the Germans. That just seems to be the way that the diplomacy sort of shapes out. And I don't fully understand that. I don't understand why I have these diplomatic chits if there really isn't much I can do other than, maybe delaying the inevitable. Maybe investing a lot in diplomacy means the Russians will attack the Germans in August of 42 rather than, April of 1942. That seems feasible. But on the whole, I don't really get a sense that my diplomacy impacts a whole lot other than delaying the inevitable. And so to me, that seems a little bit odd. I like the idea of having to make investments in certain countries and really focusing your diplomacy, but it just doesn't really feel like there's much there other than a random chance that, hey, this country might not join the enemy for a little bit longer, or hey, maybe they'll join you a little bit earlier. In addition to that, the turns are a little bit confusing to me. So the turns in this game are 14 days. So if you look in the top right-hand corner of the map, you'll see a date there. In the case of where we're at right now, it is January of 1940, January 19th. And the way this works is I'll play through my turn, which is occurring on January 14th. When I'm done and I hit the big red button on the top right that ends the turn's going to move forward by 14 days. But I'm not going to go. Actually, what will happen is it'll move forward 14 days. The Allies will then commit their turn, and then it'll come back to me 14 days later. So really, the game says turns are 14 days long, but in reality, to me, a turn is how often do I get to play? So they're really 28-day turns. And turns are really made up of two phases. They're made up of your turn, and they're made up of the Allied turn. And your turn is fought and resolved on its own. Then the Allies fight and resolve their own stuff on their own turn, and then it gets kicked back over to you. There's no simultaneous resolution. I don't do something, and then the Allies do their thing, and then it all plays out simultaneously, as I'm used to in most turn-based games. In this game, I issue orders and results come in, and then the Allies issue orders and results come in. And I'm okay with that approach, but what I don't like is this concept of a 14-day turn, and the game says it in the scenario screen, your turn length is 14 days. Well, no, it's really not, because as the Axis, you're only getting to put in orders once a month. So to me, that's just a little bit weird. I guess I'd rather either do simultaneous resolution or just remove the days altogether and just make it a monthly thing, right? Like the Axis get the first half of 19 of a month, the Allies get the second half. Like the days just seem kind of pointless at that point because it's just a weird number as far as when those turns, fall, and the date doesn't matter to me. In addition to that, I do feel like there are some units that don't add a ton of value to the game. So I mentioned, there's infantry units, there's mechanized units, there's armored units, there's air units, and I think all those work really well in the game. What I don't think really works well is artillery. I rarely see it being used. It seems to be primarily a defensive thing. The Germans start with no artillery. All the Axis start with no artillery. So it just seems like a weird kind of, you're going to say artillery is its own unit, but no one really uses it, no one really has it, and maybe the AI will build a few, and it just kind of gives a perk. If you attack someone and there's artillery behind it, they'll fire defensive fire. So it's kind of like an interceptor where, if you attack an enemy bomber, it's possible if there's enemy fighters nearby that they might intercept your fighters. So in that way, that's kind of like what artillery is for ground troops. It's almost like a fighter escort for ground troops. But it doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense. I would rather just have, like I can do already with ground units, where I add mobility or add anti-aircraft guns or add, advanced weaponry to units on sort of a little count-up ticker on the side of their unit card when I'm building them. I'd rather they just include artillery in that sense and don't have it be a unit. And there's a few other units like that feel a little bit redundant or just not really, they don't seem to provide a value. But I mean, those are kind of my main complaints. The turns just seem weird to me in terms of their resolution phase and their length. The diplomacy just kind of seems there because you probably should have diplomacy when not everybody's at war. And some of the units seem a little bit, just a little bit redundant or not necessary. I don't have a lot to say negatively about the game in general. The AI is still doing a good job of challenging me. My units are moving across the map. And actually, a couple other things that I think are really strong with this game. The way the front lines work, it really does give you a sense of like why you would try and pincer and sweep through enemy lines. Because you basically only get one turn per month to issue orders, the dates can become really tight and it can be challenging to stay on schedule. And you can see the way this game works out. Like, all right, if I'm attacking France, I'm going to target everything in on these two units to poke a hole in their lines. Then my armor can race through and attack the next line twice, break a hole there, and then potentially even move further. I can cut a really narrow line through the enemy positions and quickly encircle them and defeat them in a very World War II blitzkrieg type way. So I think the game does a good job of conveying, again, almost in like an Atlas type manner, some of the high level strategy and tactics that are going to be leveraged in a World War II game. And it does feel authentic, and it does feel like World War II when I can see my tanks rolling across France and large pockets of enemy troops cut off. I do think sometimes the game feels a little bit too rushed from its timeline perspective, because you basically only have one turn per month as either side. You've got like 3 turns to take Paris, which seems a little bit quick. And then you almost never have time to transit your forces from France after that falls to the Balkans before you're at war there in the Balkans. It feels like you're just racing through from conflict to conflict. The phony war is basically like 2 turns where the French aren't really attacking you, and then all of a sudden it's time for the invasion of France. So to me, I think sometimes the game's feels a little bit rushed, but I'm not sure how you solve for that, because I think there is some, it's part of what builds the tension and the struggle of, staying on time and taking Poland before the French can get too invested, or during your invasion of Russia, of trying to get to Moscow before winter and the seasons clamp down. The game does a really good job of sort of conveying seasons, and seasons have different effects on you and reduce your mobility, and just like terrain does. So that's all things you need to consider. In addition to that, the U.S. has these weird little things of like little hexes. It's kind of like a shield around the U.S. where if you go too close to the U.S., you'll actually kind of cause them to get alarmed and more quickly join the Allies, and I like that. And lastly, the Axis are treated as 2 separate camps, really, at least at the start of the game, where the Japanese have their own war and their own diplomacy and their own investments, and the Germans have their own war and their own diplomacy and their own investments. In countries that are at war with one, don't seem to necessarily, well, no, they're not, are not necessarily at war with the other. And I think that accurately reflects what World War II was like at this period of time. The Japanese and Germans would eventually fight on the same side in World War II, but at no point were they really fighting together. They were really fighting their own wars for their own purposes. They just had a common enemy. Even Russia was fighting a much more direct war in conjunction with the Allies in World War II. The Japanese and the Germans were really, the Japanese war was its own thing. It was very much its own war that had almost nothing to do with the German war. The reasons for the war were different, the motivations were different, the objectives were different, and for a long period of time, the combatants were different. They were just 2 wars that happened to happen at the same time, and the winning side happened to be involved in another war in a different spot of the planet. So I think the game does a good job of representing that as well. But I guess those are my initial impressions. Again, kind of summarization is, I love the art style. I love how approachable it is. I love some of the settings. I love the units and the way that these games play out. Some of the areas that I think could be done a little bit better. Diplomacy just kind of feels like I don't know why it's there. I feel like some of the units, again, just don't really seem to have a place. And the way the turns are resolved, or the way you move through the timeline of World War II, just seems a little bit odd or off to me. But that's my initial impressions with about 5 hours into the game, and we'll see about maybe doing a review further on into my experience with Strategic Command World at War, and maybe even get an interview with the developers on Single Malt Strategy with Jean and myself. That would be a lot of fun. Okay, guys, that was a lot of talking in a not very long period of time, and probably a bit of redundancy in there as well, because I'm good at that. But I do appreciate you guys tuning in for this episode. In our next video, we will return to sort of gameplay discussion. So, you did see the game playing out behind you as I was talking about it. We are into 1940. Poland has fallen. We probably will be on the verge of invading France pretty soon. We haven't actually begun the invasion in Europe. The Germans are moving their troops toward the French border. We've done some reinforcements. We allowed the Russians to occupy eastern Poland, and that's pretty much what's happening. In The Pacific Theater, the Japanese continue to fight a war of attrition and have started to make some progress toward Changsha in the sort of central southern portion of China, but we're having some terrain difficulty in bringing enough forces to bear to be able to actually take the cities. So quite a bit of fighting in the south. In the north, the Chinese have launched some counterattacks and kind of driven us back in places. There's been some partisans that have risen up, and we're trying to put all of that down and conclude the war in a successful manner. But with all of that said, I will go ahead and catch my breath, and I will sign off for you guys today. As a reminder, Strategic Command World War II War in Europe is developed by Fury Software. It is published by Matrix and Slitherine Games, and it will be launching on December 6th of this year, so in just a couple of days, Strategic Command will officially launch. It'll be available on the Matrix and Slitherine websites directly, and it will also be available on Steam for you Steam users out there. Until next time, though, I do want to thank you guys for tuning in once again to yet another episode of my channel, and I guess I'll leave you guys there. We'll pick up the live stream next time out, and until then, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.